The wind howled across the Kansas prairie the night she disappeared. No horse, no family, no place left to run. Josephine Sterling was fleeing a world of wealth, lies, and powerful men who wanted to bury her alive behind the walls of an asylum. But fate led her to Ironwood Ranch, and to Silas Montgomery, a hardened cowboy with ghosts of his own. What began as a simple act of mercy would become one of the most unforgettable love stories the frontier had ever seen. If you love stories that touch the soul, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more cinematic Western journeys.
Rain came down hard, slashing sideways across the Dodge City Depot. Colder, enough to bite. It was midnight on September the 14th, 1878, the kind of night where sensible folks stayed by the hearth. But Josephine Sterling Vance wasn't sensible anymore. She was desperate. She stood under the dripping eaves of the station, soaked to the bone, shivering. She reached down to her left hand. Her fingers were numb, but she felt the cold gold of her wedding band. She pulled it off, didn't hesitate. Just tossed it right into the thick black Kansas mud, gone. She had exactly $40 in her coat pocket. That was it, $40, and a secret worth $280,000. That was the fortune her father, Nathaniel Sterling, had left her when he passed. But in the eyes of the law back in Boston, Josie wasn't a person. She was a wife. Under the rules of coverture, a woman's wealth belonged to her husband, every penny. Arthur Vance, the man she had married, knew exactly how to play that game. When Josie tried to claim her independence, Arthur didn't just argue. He drew up papers. He hired a doctor. He was going to have her declared legally insane, a madwoman, lock her away in an asylum, take the Sterling fortune, and throw away the key. So, she ran. She wasn't just running for her money. She was running for her life, for the simple right to own her own mind. Morning broke gray and mean. Josie found a diner on the edge of town. It smelled like bacon grease, wet wool, and stale coffee. She sat in the corner, nursing a cup of hot water, trying to stop her hands from shaking. That when the bell above the door chimed, a man walked in. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a weathered canvas coat. He had the quiet, heavy step of a man who'd seen too much of the world and didn't care for most of it. This was Silas Montgomery. He walked straight to the wooden board near the door, pulled a hammer and a nail from his pocket, tacked up a piece of paper. Josie squinted at the rough handwriting. Maid wanted. Ironwood Ranch. No experience necessary. Just need an honest soul. An honest soul. Josie let out a slow, quiet breath. She didn't have honesty to offer right now, but she needed a place to hide. A ranch out in the middle of nowhere? Far from the law. Far from Arthur S. detectives. It was perfect. She stood up. Her legs were stiff. She walked over to the tall man in the canvas coat. Silas turned. He looked down at her. His eyes were pale, sharp, taking in everything in a fraction of a second. The tailored cut of her ruined dress, the expensive leather of her boots, caked in mud. Josie raised a trembling hand. She pointed to the flyer. Then, she pointed to herself. Silas frowned. You want the job? She nodded. It's hard work, he said. Cooking, scrubbing, mending. You up for that? She nodded again. Silas tilted his head. He was an ex-Pinkerton man. He made a living reading the things people tried to hide. You speak? He asked, his voice low and flat. Josie swallowed hard. If she spoke, her crisp, educated Boston accent would fill the room. It was a dead giveaway. She looked him in the eye, and she shook her head. No. Silas's gaze dropped. He looked at her hands holding the edge of her coat. Pale. Smooth. Not a single callus on her palms. No burns on her knuckles from a wood stove. This woman had never scrubbed a floor in her life. And the way she held her chin? Proud. Too proud for a beggar. He knew right then and there she was lying. She wasn't born mute. She was hiding. Behind the counter, The diner owner, an old man named Miller, let out a harsh laugh. "Aw, hell, Silas, don't do it. She's a mute. Probably soft in the head, too. Look at her. She's half-starved and broken. You bring a stray like that to Ironwood, she'll just be a burden on you. You need a real worker, not a defective woman." Silas didn't turn around immediately. He kept his eyes on Josie. He saw the flash of shame in her eyes, the way she instinctively shrank back from the word defective. Silas squared his shoulders. He turned to face the diner owner. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a bullwhip. "Listen to me, Miller, and listen good," Silas said, his words slow and deliberate. "Every human being pushed to the brink has the right to use silence as a shield. It doesn't make them broken. It makes them survivors." Miller blinked, wiping a dirty rag on the counter, suddenly at a loss for words. Silas turned back to Josie. He looked right at her, speaking loud enough for every man in that diner to hear. "I am hiring her hands for honest labor," Silas stated, his tone carrying the heavy weight of conviction. "I am not demanding the rights to her past. A woman is a person. She is not a piece of property you buy with a history attached. She has the right to be treated with dignity, whether she has a voice or not." Josie stared at him. Her chest tightened. For the first time in her life, a man hadn't looked at her as a prize to be won, or a problem to be solved. He just looked at her like a human being. Silas reached out and tapped the flyer. "Pack whatever you got," he said quietly. "Wagon leaves in 10 minutes. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask her secrets. He just opened the door and let the fresh Kansas air rush in. The wagon ride was 12 miles of hard rut and blowing dust. Josie held on to the wooden bench. Every jolt rattled her bones. The wind out here didn't howl. It swept. It pushed across the flat earth like a giant hand, bending the tall prairie grass until it nearly touched the dirt. Silas drove the team in silence. He didn't ask if she was cold. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He just kept his eyes on the horizon. Out here, the sky was too big. It made a person feel small. Back in Boston, the buildings boxed you in. They told you where you belonged. Here, there were no walls, just space. It terrified her. It thrilled her. Ironwood Ranch appeared just as the sun started to dip. It wasn't a grand estate. Far from it. It was a weathered pine cabin, a sturdy-looking barn, and a corral made of split rails. The wood was silvered from the sun. The roof had a slight sag, but smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of burning cedar cut through the chill. Silas pulled back on the reins. "Whoa." He hopped down. Didn't offer her a hand. Not out of rudeness, Josie realized. Out of habit. He was used to being alone. She climbed down, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. She pulled her coat tighter. Silas walked up past her, pushing the cabin door open. "Come on in. Wind'll freeze the blood right in your veins." The inside was simple. One main room, a cast-iron stove, a heavy oak table, a rocking chair by the fire. It was clean, though, impeccably clean. Not a speck of dust on the mantel. A man who lived alone, yet kept his house like a barracks. Silas pointed to a closed door off the kitchen. "That's your room. Old ranch hand used to sleep there. Bed S got a good tick mattress. Blankets are in the chest." Josie nodded. She walked over, pushed the door open, and looked inside. It was small, bare. A single window looking out over the endless grass. No velvet curtains. No mahogany vanity. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. When she walked back into the kitchen, Silas was standing by the table. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small slate with a wooden frame. He set it on the table, along with a piece of white chalk. "I don't know your story," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, rough but steady. "And I don't need to. But we need to understand each other. You need something, you write it down. Josie stared at the chalk. Back east, her words were weapons used against her. Every sentence was parsed by Arthur's lawyers. Every opinion was proof of her hysteria. She picked up the chalk. Her hand trembled slightly. She pressed the white tip to the slate. The scratchy sound filled the quiet cabin. She wrote slowly, deliberately. Then she turned the board around and pushed it across the table. Silas looked down. He read the words. His jaw tightened. It didn't say her name. It didn't ask for food. It read, "Thank you for treating me like a human being." Silas looked from the board up to her face. His pale eyes searched hers. "That a rare thing where you come from?" Josie didn't blink. She just nodded. Silas sighed. A heavy, tired sound. He tapped the edge of the slate. "You get some rest. Tomorrow we work." The next morning came early, too early. The sky was still black. Josie woke to the sound of Silas chopping wood outside. She dressed quickly in the cold, her fingers fumbling with the stiff buttons of her ruined dress. She tied an apron around her waist. It was time to earn her keep. She walked into the kitchen. The stove was cold. There was a slab of bacon on the counter, half a dozen eggs, and a tin of coffee. She stared at the stove. It was a massive iron beast. In Boston, she had a cook. She had maids. She knew the chemical composition of coal from her reading, but she had never actually lit a fire in her life. She opened the iron door, tossed in some kindling, struck a match. 10 minutes later, the cabin was full of thick, gray smoke. Josie coughed, her eyes watering. She grabbed a towel, fanning the air frantically. The skillet was smoking. The bacon was charred to black crisps. The coffee water was boiling over, hissing violently against the hot iron. The door swung open. Silas stood in the frame, a load of firewood in his arms. Josie froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She dropped the towel. She pressed her back against the counter, her hands up near her chest. She braced herself. She waited for the yelling. She waited for the heavy hand. She waited to be called a stupid, useless creature. That was what Arthur did when she failed. Silas didn't yell. He didn't throw the wood. He calmly walked to the wood box, dropped the logs. He stepped over to the window, threw the latch, and pushed it open to let the smoke out. Then he walked to the stove, grabbed a thick cloth, and pulled the burning skillet off the heat. Josie was shaking. She grabbed her chalk. She scribbled furiously on the slate, tears of panic and shame blurring her vision. She shoved the board toward him. "I am sorry. I am a useless woman. I do not know how to do this. Forgive me." Silas read it. He wiped soot from his hands with a rag. Then he looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the terror in her posture. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Josie," Silas said. It was the first time he used the name she'd signed on a piece of paper that morning. "Look at me." She slowly raised her head. "I need you to listen to me," Silas said, his voice firm, clear, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "And I need you to remember this. There is no such thing as men's work or women's work out here. There is only work that needs doing so we can survive the winter." He tapped the slate. "You wrote that you are a useless woman. That is a lie taught to you by fools. Ignorance is not a permanent condition. It is just a starting line. Being clumsy isn't a sin. Making a mistake is not a crime. Refusing to learn is the only thing I consider a failure." He stepped closer, handing her the rag. "A person's worth is not measured by what they don't know," Silas continued, speaking the words like a vow. "It is measured by their willingness to stand back up and try again. Equality means we both start the fire together until you know how the sparks catch. Understand?" Josie stared at him. The panic in her chest slowly untied itself. A knot loosening, she took a shuddering breath. She wiped her eyes. She nodded. "Good," Silas said. Now, come over here. I'm going to show you how to open the damper. Fire needs to breathe, just like people. He stood beside her, not towering over her. Beside her, he showed her the levers. He showed her the draft. Later that morning, it was the cow, a mean-spirited Jersey named Bessie. Josie sat on the small wooden stool. The bucket was between her knees. She squeezed. Nothing happened. She squeezed harder. The cow shifted, agitated, nearly kicking the bucket over. Josie let out a frustrated breath. Silas was mending a bridle nearby. He watched for a moment. Then he set the leather down. He walked over. You're treating her like a machine, Silas said. She's flesh and blood. You pull too hard, she fights back. You have to be firm, but gentle. Like this. He knelt in the dirt right beside her. He reached out. His large, calloused hands covered her small, pale ones. Josie stiffened, but his touch wasn't a threat. It was a guide. He moved her hands. He showed her the rhythm. Squeeze, pull, release. Squeeze, pull, release. A sharp hiss of milk hit the tin bucket. Josie gasped. A genuine, bright smile broke across her face. She looked at Silas. Silas met her eyes. He let go of her hands and stood up. He cleared his throat, suddenly, looking everywhere but at her. Just takes practice, he muttered, turning his back and walking out of the barn. Josie stayed on the stool. She listened to the rhythmic ping of the milk hitting the tin. She looked at her hands. They were covered in dirt. It smelled like cow and smoke. For the first time in 34 years, they felt like her own hands. 3 weeks passed. The harsh edge of November crept over the plains. The wind grew teeth. Frost coated the grass every morning, sparkling like broken glass under the pale sun. Josie's hands changed. The soft, manicured skin of a Boston heiress was gone, replaced by minor burns, small cuts, a thickening on the palms from gripping the axe handle to split kindling. She didn't hide them anymore. She liked them. They were proof she was alive. One afternoon, Silas rode out to the South Ridge to check a downed fence line. He'd be gone until dusk. Josie was alone in the cabin. She had finished sweeping. She moved to Silas's corner of the room. It was a small desk. Usually, she didn't touch it. But the dust was gathering heavy on the bookshelf above it. She stood on her toes. She pulled a cloth over the rough-hewn pine. As she did, she knocked a small wooden box. It shifted, and a book slid out, falling onto the desk with a heavy thud. Josie picked it up. It wasn't a printed book. It was a leather-bound ledger. The leather was worn soft from years of handling. The edges were frayed. She opened it. It was Silas's handwriting. Bold, blocky, precise. She flipped the page. May 1871, Chicago. Pinkerton Detective Agency. Subject, striking rail workers. Josie frowned. Pinkerton? Silas was a Pinkerton detective? They were the hired muscle of the industrial barons back east. Her own father, Nathaniel Sterling, had dealt with them. Arthur, her husband, used them to intimidate rival businessmen. They were not known for their mercy, she read further. June 3rd, ordered to break the picket line. Used force. 3 men injured. 1 man, Thomas O'Connor, arrested for inciting riot. O'Connor died in holding cell. Cause of death, head trauma sustained during arrest. Left behind a wife, Catherine, and 3 children. Josie stopped breathing. She looked at the bottom of the page. The ink was pressed so hard into the paper, it had nearly torn right through. I am a tool for the devil. I am enforcing laws written by thieves to punish starving men. I resign tomorrow. May God have mercy on my rotten soul. Josie closed the book slowly. She traced the worn leather cover. She looked out the window at the vast, empty prairie. Silas wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from himself. He carried a ghost on his back. That was why he lived alone. That was why he looked at the ground when she smiled at him. He believed he was a monster. The cabin door opened. Josie spun around. The ledger was still in her hands. Silas stood in the doorway. Snow dusted his shoulders. He looked at her. He looked at the book in her hands. The silence stretched. It pulled tight, like a wire ready to snap. Josie didn't drop the book. She didn't cower. She held it, looking him right in the eye. Silas stepped inside. He closed the door. He took off his hat. He didn't yell. He didn't snatch the book from her hands. He just looked incredibly tired. "You read it?" he said. It wasn't a question. Josie nodded. She walked over to the table, set the book down, and picked up her slate. She wrote quickly, then showed it to him. "I did not mean to pry." It fell. Silas stared at the chalkboard. He let out a breath. "Doesn't matter. It's the truth. Ain't pretty, but it's the truth." He walked past her, hanging his coat on the peg. "I busted heads for rich men back east. I made widows. I enforced the law, and the law was wicked. You have a right to know what kind of man you're taking wages from." Josie watched his broad back. He was bracing for her judgment. He expected her to pack her things. She wiped the slate clean. She wrote again, pushed it onto the table in front of him. "You left." Silas looked down at the two words. "Leaving doesn't bring a dead man out of the dirt, Josie." The next day, Silas rode into Dodge City for supplies. He returned late. He walked into the cabin, shaking the snow from his boots. He carried a flour sack. He set the groceries on the counter, but he kept one item in his hand. He walked over to the table where Josie was peeling potatoes. He set a package wrapped in brown paper in front of her. Josie wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at him questioningly. "Open it," Silas said. She untied the string. She peeled back the paper. Inside was a thick, beautiful journal. The leather was fresh and smelled of oil. Beside it lay a brass fountain pen and a bottle of black ink. These were not cheap items. Not for a dirt-poor rancher. Josie looked up at him, her eyes wide. "That slate is too damn small," Silas grumbled, refusing to look her in the eye. "A person's thoughts shouldn't be boxed up in 6 square inches. You got things to say. Say them." That night, after the dishes were washed and the fire was banked low, they sat at the heavy oak table. The only sound was the howling wind outside and the ticking of the clock. Josie opened the new journal. She uncapped the fountain pen. She dipped the nib. She thought for a long time. Then she began to write. Her handwriting was elegant, flowing, the cursive of a highly educated woman. She didn't try to hide it anymore. He knew she wasn't a simple maid. He had chosen not to care. She wrote a full page. Then she slid the open book across the wood to Silas. Silas leaned forward. The lantern light flickered over his face. He read the words silently at first. Then his brow furrowed. He looked at her. "I want to make sure I understand you," Silas said softly. He looked back down at the page and read her words out loud. His voice filled the quiet room. "A truly cruel man never questions his own actions," Silas read, his voice catching slightly on the words. "A wicked man sleeps soundly. Your conscience is bleeding, Silas. And that is the greatest proof that you are a good, honorable man. You carry the weight of that family because you know it was wrong. But punishing yourself in this isolation does not balance the scales." Silas stopped reading. He stared at the wet ink. He swallowed hard. "It's a debt I can't repay," he whispered. Josie took the book back. She dipped the pen. She wrote another paragraph. She pushed it back. Silas read it aloud again, speaking the words like a prayer he was trying to learn. "Healing never comes from trying to erase our past mistakes," Silas read, his voice steadying, gaining strength as he absorbed the truth in her words. "It is impossible to unwrite history. True redemption does not come from hiding in the dark. It comes from using the very hands that once caused harm to plant new seeds of kindness. You cannot save the man who died, but you can protect the living. That is how you pay the debt, by deciding to be a shield instead of a sword. Silas closed the book gently. He looked across the table at Josie. The flickering light caught the intelligence in her eyes, the profound, deep understanding of a woman who had suffered her own unseen horrors. He leaned back in his chair. "I want you to hear me clearly, Josie," Silas said, speaking directly to her, verbalizing the lesson she had just taught him. "For 3 years, I believed that, because my hands were stained, I had no right to build anything good. I believed a man's worth was defined by his worst day. You are telling me that a human being is capable of change. You are telling me that compassion isn't something you are born with and lose. It's a choice you have to make every single morning when you wake up." Josie nodded. A single tear escaped, tracing down her cheek. "You are a very wise woman," Silas said quietly. "And whoever made you feel like you had to hide your voice, they are the ones who are truly blind." He reached across the table. He didn't grab her hand. He just rested his large, rough fingers gently against the wooden table, an inch from hers. "We start planting new seeds tomorrow," Silas said. Josie looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. She smiled, and the silence in the cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like home. The mud in Dodge City was a stubborn thing. It clung to wagon wheels. It ruined good leather. Hiram Locke didn't care for mud. He was a city man. Pinstripe suit, bowler hat, a silver pocket watch that ticked a little too loud. He stood on the boardwalk outside the telegraph office, scraping the sole of his boot against an iron boot jack. Locke was a private investigator. He was cheap and he was gentle. He worked for Arthur Vance, the Boston lawyer who had a very big problem, a $280,000 problem. His wife had vanished. Locke walked into the saloon. It was noon, quiet. He ordered a whiskey he didn't intend to drink. He laid a sketch on the sticky mahogany bar. It was a charcoal drawing of a woman, high cheekbones, proud chin, eyes that looked like they belonged in a library, not a saloon. "Looking for a lady," Locke said. His voice was smooth, oiled. "Might be confused, might be claiming she lost her memory. Her husband is worried sick. Generous man, too. Paying a $50 reward just for a direction." The bartender squinted at the paper. He wiped a glass, shook his head. "Ain't seen no fancy ladies around here, mister. Just the working girls and the ranch wives. Ain't none of 'em look like that." Locke smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. She wouldn't look fancy now. She'd look scared, desperate. Keep your eyes open. He left the sketch on the bar, pinned down by a silver dollar. Locke had time. He was a bloodhound, and bloodhounds never stopped tracking. 12 miles west, the wind was picking up. Mateo Flores rode his mule up to the Ironwood Corral. Mateo was a good neighbor. He was a proud man. Born in Mexico, but he'd worked at Kansas dirt for 20 years. His hands were like cracked leather. Today, Mateo didn't look proud. He looked small, defeated. Silas stepped out of the barn, a pitchfork in his hand. He saw Mateo's slumped shoulders. Silas stuck the pitchfork in the hay and walked over to the fence. "Morning, Mateo," Silas said. "Coffee is hot inside." Mateo shook his head. He reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It looked heavy in his hands. "Mr. Montgomery," Mateo said. His accent was thick. His voice wavered. "I ask a favor. I need your eyes. You read the English good." "I read it fine," Silas said. He wiped his hands on his trousers. "What do you have there?" "Mr. Higgins?" Mateo spat the name. Higgins was the Anglo landowner who owned the valley parcel Mateo farmed. He give me this. New lease. He say I sign it by tomorrow or I have to leave before the snow hits. My wife, Maria, she is sick with the cough. I cannot move her in the cold. Silas frowned. He took the paper. Josie had stepped out onto the porch to shake out a rug. She paused. She watched the two men. She stepped quietly to the edge of the porch, listening. Silas unfolded the document. It was 3 pages of dense, cramped legal type. He started reading. His brow furrowed. Silas was a smart man. He knew the law from his Pinkerton days. But this wasn't criminal law. This was contract law. A rich man's weapon. Mateo, Silas muttered, tracing a line with his thick finger. This says your rent is doubling. And here, this clause. It says, if you miss a payment by a single day, all improvements on the land forfeit to the owner. That means the barn you built, the irrigation ditch you dug, all of it becomes his. Mateo took off his hat. He crushed it in his hands. He say it is standard. He say everybody signs. It's a trap, Silas said, his voice hard. But if you don't sign, he evicts you. Legally, he has the right. It's his land. Josie dropped the rug. She didn't think. She just moved. She stepped off the porch and marched straight to Silas. She didn't ask. She reached out and snatched the paper right out of his hands. Silas blinked. Josie, what are you? Josie ignored him. She looked at the contract. Her eyes darted across the page. Her mind, trained by 12 years of reading her father S. corporate law books, snapped into sharp, brilliant focus. She saw the loopholes. She saw the malicious intent. It was sloppy work. The work of a greedy man who assumed the reader was uneducated. She spun around. She grabbed a pencil from Silas' shirt pocket. She slapped the paper down on the flat top of a fence post, and she went to work. She slashed thick black lines through paragraph 4. She crossed out the forfeiture clause with a vengeance. In the margins, her hand flew, writing tight, perfectly legible legal vernacular. She added a grace period clause. She added a compensation for improvements. Addendum. Mateo watched her, bewildered. What is she doing, Senor Silas? Silas didn't answer. He was staring at Josie. He watched the way she held the pencil. Not like a maid, like a judge, like a woman who owned the world and was currently annoyed by its incompetence. Josie finished. She tapped the pencil hard against the paper. She shoved it into Mateo's hands. Then she pulled her small slate from her apron pocket. She wrote furiously. The chalk snapped in half. She didn't care. She finished, thrust the board at Silas, and pointed a commanding finger at him. She tapped the board. Read it. Her eyes demanded it. Silas looked at the board. He cleared his throat. He looked at Mateo, and he read her words loud and clear over the Kansas wind. Listen to me, Mateo, Silas read, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of Josie's written words. The law was created to protect justice, not to be used as a weapon for the wealthy to exploit the hardworking. This contract was a theft disguised as paper. Equality begins when every man and woman fully understands their rightful claims. Do not let them blind you with words. You go back to Higgins. You tell him your lawyer adjusted the terms to comply with the Kansas Territory Fair Use Doctrine. He will sign it because he knows the original was illegal. Mateo stood frozen. He looked at the heavily edited paper. Then he looked at the mute maid in the faded dress. He didn't fully understand the legal terms, but he understood the fire in her eyes. He understood that someone had finally stood up for him. Mateo pressed his hat to his chest. He bowed his head to Josie, a deep, respectful bow. Gracias, Senora. Que Dios te bendiga. May God bless you. He mounted his mule and rode off, sitting a little taller in the saddle. Silas watched him go. Then he turned to Josie. The wind blew her hair across her face. The adrenaline was fading. She suddenly realized what she had just done. The shell was broken. She had exposed herself. No uneducated maid knew the Kansas Territory fair use doctrine. She looked down at her boots. She waited for the questions, the interrogation. Silas reached out. He gently plucked the broken piece of chalk from her fingers. "I reckon," Silas said quietly, "that Higgins is going to have a very bad afternoon." He didn't ask where she learned the law. He didn't ask who she was running from. He just turned and walked back to the barn. Josie watched his back. A profound sense of relief washed over her. He knew she was a woman of wealth and education, and it didn't change a single thing. Winter hit Ironwood like a hammer. In late November, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. Then the snow came. It didn't drift down in gentle flakes. It drove sideways, a blinding white wall that buried the fences and silenced the world. For 3 days, Silas and Josie were trapped inside the cabin. Survival became a dance, a quiet, synchronized routine. Silas kept the fire roaring. He braved the whiteout twice a day. Following a rope he tied between the cabin and the barn to feed Bessie and the horses. Josie kept the coffee hot. She baked bread. She mended socks. The small space forced an intimacy that neither of them could avoid. They sat by the fire at night. The wind screamed outside, trying to tear the shingles off the roof. Inside, it was warm, safe. Silas sat in the rocking chair, polishing his rifle. Josie sat at the table, the leather journal open in front of her. Silas set the rag down. He stared into the flames. The howling wind seemed to drag memories out of him, dark ones. "It was weather like this," Silas said suddenly. His voice was a low murmur, barely cutting through the sound of the storm. Josie stopped writing. She looked up. "Chicago. 71, Silas continued. He didn't look at her. He just looked at the fire. The rail workers were striking. They hadn't been paid in 2 months. Men were freezing in the tenements. My boss at Pinkerton, he got a contract from the rail baron. "Clear the tracks," he said, "by any means necessary." Josie held her breath. She remembered the name from his ledger, Thomas O'Connor. "I led the squad," Silas said. His hands tightened on the rifle stock. His knuckles turned white. "We marched down there, men with clubs and badges, against men with empty bellies." Thomas O'Connor stood at the front. He threw a rock. "Hit my deputy." I stepped forward. I brought my baton down on his head. Hard. Silas closed his eyes. The pain in his face was raw, unfiltered. "I arrested him," Silas whispered. "I threw him in the wagon. I locked him in the cell. I told myself I was doing my job, keeping the peace." He died 3 hours later, bled into his own brain. "I left a widow and 3 starving kids behind because a rich man told me to." He looked up. He finally met Josie S. eyes. "You wrote that I am an honorable man, Josie," Silas said, his voice breaking slightly. "But an honorable man doesn't hide behind a badge to commit murder. I was part of a machine that grinds the poor into dust. And I chose to swing the hammer." Josie stared at him. Her heart ached. She knew about the machine. Her father had helped build it. Her husband operated it. She had been a prisoner of it. She picked up her fountain pen. She dipped it in the ink. She didn't write quickly. She took her time. Every word was a deliberate strike against the darkness consuming him. She stood up. She walked over to the fire. She knelt beside his rocking chair and placed the open journal in his lap. Silas looked down. He read her elegant script. He read it silently. Then he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Read it aloud," she gestured with her hand. She wanted to hear the words fill the room. She wanted them to be real. Silas took a deep breath. His voice shook at first, but it steadied as the truth of her words anchored him. "We are taught that obedience to authority is a virtue," Silas read. We are told that the law is a moral compass, but that is a lie, spun by those who write the laws to protect their own gold. When a system demands cruelty, obedience becomes a sin. Disobedience becomes the only moral choice. You were a soldier in a rich man's war, Silas. You committed a terrible wrong. But the day you threw down your badge, you broke the machine. A monster does not weep for his victims. A man does. You are a man, and it is time you forgave him. Silas traced his thumb over the wet ink. He stared at the page for a long, long time. The wind battered the cabin walls, but inside, the silence was profound. "How do you know all this?" Silas asked softly. "How does a woman who won't speak know so much about the crushing weight of the world?" Josie smiled a sad, tight smile. She took the book from him. She wrote one sentence and handed it back. "Because I was born in a gilded cage, and the bars are still made of iron." The storm broke on the fourth day. The sky cleared, leaving a brilliant, blinding blue. Silas hitched the horses to the sleigh. He needed to go to Miller S. Creek, the small settlement 4 miles away, to buy salt and kerosene. "Lock the door," Silas told Josie as he buttoned his heavy coat. "Don't open it for anyone." He rode into town. The settlement was digging itself out. Silas walked into the general store. It was warm, smelling of peppermint and wet wool. Old man Higgins was there buying tobacco. Higgins scowled when he saw Silas. "You," Higgins pointed a fat finger, "that Mexican neighbor of yours." He brought back a contract that looked like a dog chewed on it. Full of legal nonsense. Claimed his lawyer wrote it. Cost me $40 in concessions to keep him from taking it to the magistrate. Silas didn't smile, but his eyes gleamed. Sounds like Mateo got himself a good lawyer. He bought his supplies. As he was loading the sleigh, the store owner leaned over the counter. "Hey, Silas," the owner said low. "Feller came through right before the snow hit. City type, wearing a bowler, flashing a lot of cash." Silas froze. "What was he looking for?" "A woman," the owner said. "Runaway wife." Said her name was Josephine Vance. "Heiress to some massive fortune back east." Said she was crazy in the head. Dangerous to herself. Had papers from a judge in Boston to drag her back to an asylum. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. Josephine Vance. A gilded cage. The legal knowledge. The soft hands. The absolute terror of being discovered. It all snapped into place. Perfectly, Silas didn't ask any more questions. He threw the supplies into the sleigh. He whipped the reins. He pushed the horses hard, the sleigh runners cutting deep tracks into the fresh snow. He didn't feel angry that she had lied. He didn't feel betrayed. He felt a cold, hard rage building in his chest. But it wasn't directed at Josie. It was directed at a world that would take a brilliant, compassionate woman, a woman who used her mind to save a poor farmer from ruin, and try to throw her in a madhouse just to steal her money. He pulled up to the cabin. The smoke was rising cheerfully from the chimney. Silas walked inside. Josie was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. She looked over her shoulder and smiled. It was a real smile, bright and warm. Silas closed the door behind him. He threw the heavy iron bolt. He walked over to her. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her, not as a maid, not as a broken stray, but as a queen who had been dethroned by thieves. "Dinner smells good," Silas said. His voice was completely steady. He wasn't going to push her. He wasn't going to demand the truth. He was going to stand by the door with his rifle, and God help any man from Boston who tried to take her away. The cold didn't just chill you out here. It hunted you. It was the second week of December. The blizzard had passed, but the snow it left behind was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It sat on the roof of the old barn like wet cement. Silas knew the beams were old. He knew they were bowing. He went out right after dawn. He carried a long wooden pole to knock the snow loose. The air was so brittle it hurt to breathe. The sky was a pale, empty blue. Josie was inside the cabin. She was kneading dough. The rhythmic push and pull of her hands was soothing. The fire crackled. The coffee smelled strong and bitter. It was a good morning, a quiet morning, until the crack. It sounded like a cannon shot, sharp, violent. It echoed across the frozen valley. Josie dropped the dough. She froze. She listened. Nothing. No shout. No sound of the horses. Just the wind. She wiped her hands on her apron. She moved to the window. She wiped the frost from the glass. She looked out toward the barn. The center of the roof was gone, caved in. A massive pile of snow and splintered pine lay exactly where Silas had been standing. Panic hit her chest like a physical blow. Josie didn't grab her coat. She didn't grab her boots. She threw the heavy cabin door open and ran out into the freezing snow in only her wool stockings and house dress. The snow was up to her knees. It burned like fire. She fell twice. She scrambled up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Silas! She tried to scream his name, but her throat clamped shut. Her vow of silence held tight, even in terror. She choked on the silent cry. She reached the barn. Dust and snow hung in the air. Silas! She screamed in her mind. Then she saw him. He was dragging himself out from under a shattered support beam. His coat was torn. His face was gray. He was gripping his left arm tight against his chest. Blood was spilling between his fingers. Bright, red, too much of it. It steamed in the freezing air, dripping onto the pristine snow. Josie rushed to him. She grabbed his right arm, throwing it over her shoulder. She was small, but she used every ounce of leverage she had. I'm all right, Silas gritted out. His teeth were bared. Just get me to the cabin. It was a grueling, agonizing walk. 50 yards felt like 50 miles. They stumbled up the porch steps. They fell through the door. Silas slumped into the chair by the stove. He was breathing hard. The blood was pooling on the floorboards. Josie didn't panic anymore. The initial shock burned away. A cold, absolute focus took over. This was a crisis, and Josephine Sterling Vance knew how to manage a crisis. She ran to the wash basin. She grabbed the kettle of boiling water off the stove, poured it into a bowl. She grabbed a clean linen towel, a bottle of cheap whiskey from the top shelf, and the sewing kit Silas kept on his desk. She knelt beside him. It's a bad tear, Josie, Silas whispered. His eyes were getting cloudy. Nail caught me, ripped it wide open. Josie took his bloody hand. She pulled his coat sleeve back. The heavy canvas was soaked. She didn't flinch. She took her sewing scissors and cut the flannel shirt sleeve completely away. The wound was jagged, deep, running from his elbow halfway down to his wrist. She took the whiskey. She didn't ask. She just poured it straight over the open flesh. Silas roared. His back arched. His right hand gripped the wooden armrest so hard the wood groaned. But he didn't pull away. Josie took the hot towel. She cleaned the edges. She worked fast. Her hands were perfectly steady. She grabbed the sewing needle. It was meant for canvas thick and curved. She held it over the open flame of a candle to sterilize it, just like the Sterling family doctor had done when he stitched up her father's carriage accident. Years ago, she threaded it with thick black cotton. She looked up at Silas. Her eyes told him to brace himself. Then she pushed the needle through his skin. She didn't stitch like a frightened maid patching a shirt. She stitched like a surgeon. Clean, even spacing. The whip stitch method to pull the torn muscle together before closing the skin. Pulling the thread tight to stop the bleeding, but not so tight it would tear. Lock knot. Next stitch. Lock knot. 10 minutes later, it was done. A perfect, neat line of black thread closing the terrible wound. She wrapped it tightly with clean white gauze. She sat back on her heels. She let out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were covered in his blood. She looked up. Silas wasn't passing out. He was watching her. The pain was still in his eyes, but it was eclipsed by a sharp, piercing clarity. He was looking at her hands. The cabin was dead silent. The fire popped. Silas didn't look away. He leaned his head back against the chair. "I've seen battlefield doctors work slower than that," Silas said. His voice was rough from the whiskey and the pain. Josie froze. She realized what she had done. A farm girl from Missouri didn't know how to sterilize a needle or tie a surgical knot. She had dropped her shield. She scrambled backward, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked toward the door, flight instinct taking over.
"Stop!"
Silas commanded softly. She stopped. She looked at him, her chest heaving. Silas let out a long breath. He looked at the perfect bandage on his arm. Then he looked right into her eyes. "Your name isn't Jane," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet truth. Josie stared at him. The silence stretched tight. She closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to demand answers. She was in his house. She had lied to him for months. "Josie, open your eyes." She opened them. Silas wasn't angry. He looked sad, but mostly he looked resolute. He sat forward, wincing slightly as his arm shifted. He made sure she was listening to every word. "I want you to hear this," Silas said, his voice steady, anchoring her to the room. "And I want you to remember it. I am not going to interrogate you. I am not going to ask you who you are hiding from. You want to know why? Because forcing a confession out of a frightened human being isn't justice. It's just another kind of tyranny." Josie's breath hitched. She stared at him, stunned. Silas pointed to his own chest, then to hers. "A person's truth is their own private property, Josie. A woman has the absolute right to her own secrets, especially when the world has given her a reason to run. Trust isn't something a man can demand with a loud voice. Trust is a bridge. It has to be built by two people. I will stay on my side of the bridge. I will not pry. I will not push." He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment against the pain. "I will wait," Silas finished, "until the day you decide my ears are worthy of your words. Until then, you are safe here, no matter who is hunting you." Josie sat on the floor, the bloody towel in her lap. She had spent 12 years with a man who believed every thought in her head belonged to him. And now, this rough, scarred cowboy was handing her back the keys to her own soul. She reached for her slate, which sat on the floor near the table leg. She wiped it clean with the hem of her apron. She picked up the chalk. She didn't write her real name. She wasn't ready yet, but she wrote the only thing that mattered. "I trust you, Silas." She held it up. Silas read it. A small, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Good. Now help me get this bloody shirt off before it sticks to the wound." The thaw came 3 days later. The heavy snow turned to slush. The roads became passable, and trouble never waited for the mud to dry. It was dusk. The sky was the color of bruised plums. Silas was sitting at the table, his left arm in a sling. He was trying to roll a cigarette one-handed. Josie was standing at the stove, stirring beans. They heard the horses first, heavy hooves sucking in the mud. Then the jingle of harness brass. Silas stopped. He set the tobacco down. He stood up slowly. He reached for the Winchester rifle, leaning against the wall near the door. "Stay away from the window," Silas muttered. Josie dropped the wooden spoon. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She backed away from the stove, retreating into the shadows near her bedroom door. Heavy boots hit the porch. The floorboards creaked. Then A sharp, loud knock on the door. 3 raps. Authoritative. Arrogant. "Open up," a voice shouted. A city voice. Smooth and sharp. "I know you're in there, Montgomery." Silas didn't answer. He checked the action on the rifle. Lever down. Lever up. A brass cartridge slid smoothly into the chamber. "I am acting on legal authority," the voice yelled again. Josie's blood ran cold. She knew that phrase. It was the language of Arthur S. World. Silas reached out and unbolted the door. He swung it open, but he stood squarely in the frame. He held the rifle casually across his chest, his finger resting just outside the trigger guard. Hiram Locke stood on the porch. He was wearing a heavy wool coat over his pinstripe suit. 2 armed men stood behind him in the mud. Hired guns from Dodge. Locke looked at Silas. Then he tried to look past him, peering into the dark cabin. "Can I help you?" Silas asked, flatly. "I'm looking for a woman," Locke said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "And my sources in town tell me she's been hiding under your roof, playing the mute." Locke didn't wait for Silas to answer. He raised his voice, shouting over Silas' shoulder into the cabin. "Josephine Sterling Vance, the game is over. Your husband has been worried sick. Come out here immediately." In the shadows, Josie squeezed her eyes shut. She clamped her hands over her ears. Josephine Sterling Vance. The name sounded like a death sentence. It sounded like the metallic click of a lock turning on an asylum door. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't turn around to look at Josie. "You're trespassing on ironwood dirt," Silas said. "State your business to me or get off my porch." Locke sneered. He held up the paper. It had a gold seal on it. "This is a medical guardianship warrant," Locke declared proudly, "issued by the probate court of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Mrs. Vance has been declared legally incompetent due to severe hysteria and mental break. Her husband, Arthur Vance, holds full legal custody over her person and her assets. I am here to retrieve her and transport her back to a medical facility in Boston." Locke took a step forward. "Move aside, Cowboy. You're harboring a fugitive lunatic." Silas didn't move an inch. He shifted the rifle slightly. "Let me see that paper," Silas said. Locke hesitated, then shoved it toward Silas's chest. Silas took it with his one good hand. He held it up to the fading light. He scanned the dense legal text. He looked at the signature. Then, Silas chuckled. A cold, dry sound. He crumpled the heavy parchment in his fist and tossed it back onto the wet porch at Locke's feet. Locke's face flushed red. "You ignorant dirt farmer. That is a legal document." "It's toilet paper," Silas said smoothly. "You're a long way from Boston City, boy. You're standing in Kansas territory. We have our own laws here." Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal calm of an ex-Pinkerton enforcer. "I suggest you read the Kansas Territorial Code, Section 4, Paragraph 2, Silas stated clearly. "A foreign medical mandate requires a secondary examination and a countersignature from a territorial magistrate to be actionable. That paper ain't got a Kansas seal on it, which means it ain't worth a damn thing. You try to take anyone from my house without a local warrant, that is kidnapping, and in Kansas, we hang kidnappers. We don't wait for a trial." Locke stared at him. He looked at the 2 hired guns in the mud. The hired guns looked at Silas's rifle, then took a slow step backward. $50 wasn't worth taking a bullet from a man who clearly knew how to shoot. Locke gritted his teeth. He pointed a leather-gloved finger at Silas. "I will ride into town," Locke hissed. "I will wake up the magistrate. I will get that signature, and I will be back by tomorrow noon with the sheriff. Enjoy your night, Montgomery. It's the last one she spends outside a padded cell." Locke turned on his heel. He marched down the steps, mounted his horse, and the three men rode off into the gathering dark. Silas watched them until they were swallowed by the shadows. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door. He threw the heavy iron bolt. He leaned the rifle against the wall. He turned around. Josie was standing in the center of the kitchen. She was shaking. The chalk slate was clutched in her hands, but she wasn't writing. The chalk was snapped in half. The silence in the room was deafening. It wasn't a peaceful silence anymore. It was a prison. Silas walked over to the table. He sat down heavily. He didn't ask her to explain. He just waited. He honored his promise. He stayed on his side of the bridge. Josie looked at the slate. She looked at the man who had just risked his life to defend a woman he barely knew, a man who respected her enough not to force her hand. She couldn't write this. The chalk was too slow. The slate was too small. She dropped the chalkboard. It clattered against the wooden floorboards. She opened her mouth. Her throat was tight, dry from 6 months of disuse. She took a breath. It felt like swallowing ground glass. The sound was small, a rusty whisper. Silas froze. His head snapped up. Josie swallowed hard. She forced the air past her vocal cords. He is going to lock me away. Her voice broke into the cabin. It wasn't the voice of a maid. It was crisp, refined, the undeniable, educated accent of Boston high society. But it was raw with pure, unfiltered terror. Silas stood up slowly. Josie, my name is Josephine, she said, her voice growing stronger, the words spilling out like water breaking through a dam. My name is Josephine Sterling. My father died 3 months ago. He left me everything. $280,000. The mills. The shipping lines. He left it to me, Silas, because he knew my husband was a parasite. She began to pace. Her hands were flying. The dam had burst. But Arthur knew the law, Josie said, her voice rising, filling the room with a passionate, desperate fury. He knew that if a woman refuses to surrender her property, a man only has to prove she is incompetent to manage it. A husband S word against a wife S. He paid a doctor. He drafted the papers. He was going to drug me, declare me a hysteric, and lock me in the basement of a sanitarium for the rest of my natural life so he could take my father's money. Silas stood perfectly still. The sheer cruelty of the plot settled over him like a cold sweat. Josie stopped pacing. She looked at Silas, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were ablaze with absolute defiance. She needed him to understand. She needed to speak the truth out loud, into the universe, to reclaim her own humanity. I didn't play mute because I was crazy, Silas, Josie said, her voice ringing clear and steady now, delivering a profound, undeniable truth. I played mute because out there, a woman S voice is considered completely worthless. When we speak up for our rights, they call us hysterical. When we refuse to surrender our property, they call us insane. The law does not see a woman as a citizen. It sees her as a vessel for a man's wealth. She stepped closer to him. A woman's human rights do not exist when the law ties her very survival to her husband's bank account, she declared fiercely. They use the law as a chain. I stripped off my wedding ring. I threw away my name, and I silenced my own tongue because I realized something terrible. I realized I would rather be a free, voiceless maid, scrubbing floors in the dirt of Kansas, than live as an enslaved queen in a mansion in Massachusetts. Josie stopped. She was breathing hard. The silence returned to the cabin. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. Electric. She had spoken. She had claimed her truth. Silas looked at the woman standing before him. Not a maid, not a victim. A warrior who had fought her way out of a gilded trap. He didn't pity her, he respected her. Silas walked over to the door. He picked up the Winchester rifle. He checked the magazine, making sure it was fully loaded. Then he walked back to the table and set the rifle down right in front of her. "Well, Josephine Sterling," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You have your voice back. Now, we're going to make damn sure nobody ever takes it away again. Let Locke come tomorrow. We'll be ready." Morning came pale and sharp. The fire had burned down to embers overnight. The cabin was freezing. But neither Silas nor Josie noticed the cold. The air in the room was already too heavy to breathe. Silas was up before dawn. He didn't make coffee. He didn't go out to feed Bessie. He sat at the heavy oak table. A worn leather pouch sat in front of him. Josie stepped out of her small room. She wore her faded work dress. She looked at Silas. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a wink. His face was drawn tight. The lines around his eyes looked deeper. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the pouch. He reached out, untied the leather string. He turned it over and dumped the contents onto the rough wood. Gold coins, silver dollars, a stack of greenbacks folded tight. It was every cent he had. 3 years of blood, sweat, and freezing winters. All of it sitting in a messy pile next to the salt shaker. Josie stopped in the doorway. "Silas, what are you doing?" Her voice still felt strange in the room, new, but fitting perfectly. Silas kept his eyes on the money. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a train schedule he'd picked up in town weeks ago. He laid it next to the cash. "There's a train leaving Dodge at 3 o'clock, Silas said. His voice was flat, empty. "Head straight to Denver. This is $400. It's enough for a private sleeper car, a good hotel when you arrive, and a retainer for the best damn lawyer in the state of Colorado." Josie stared at the money. Her stomach dropped. "I don't understand," she said softly. Silas finally looked up. His pale eyes were full of a terrible, quiet grief. "Locke is coming back, Josie," Silas said. "He'll have the sheriff with him. And the sheriff respects the law. If that paper has a local signature on it, I can stop them. Not legally. And if I shoot a lawman to keep you here, I hang. And you go back to Boston anyway." He stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the snow. He put his back to her. He couldn't look her in the eye. "You're Sterling," Silas said. The name tasted bitter in his mouth. "You come from money, real money. You have an education I can't even fathom. I am just a dirt farmer, an ex-thug trying to scratch a living out of the dust. I can fight Arthur Vance. I don't have the tools. You need a big city lawyer. You need power to fight power." He turned around. He pointed to the table. "Take the money, Josie. Pack your things. I'll hitch the wagon. You can disappear in Denver. You can fight him from there." Josie looked at the $400. She knew what that money meant. It was his seed money for spring. It was the new roof. It was his future. And he was handing it to her, pushing her out the door, because he thought he wasn't good enough to stand beside her. 12 years. For 12 years, she had let a man tell her where she belonged. Arthur had told her she was too fragile, too hysterical, too weak to manage her own life. And now, a good man was telling her to leave, trying to save her by sending her away. Josie walked to the table. She didn't touch the money. She picked up the brown paper envelope he had placed the cash on. She picked it up, and with a sharp, violent motion, she tore it directly in half. The tearing sound was loud in the quiet kitchen. Silas flinched. "Josie, stop," Josie commanded. Her voice didn't waver. It rang with absolute authority. She walked right up to him. She didn't cower. She stood tall, tilting her chin up to look him squarely in the eye. "I am not running anymore," Josie said. Her words were clipped, precise. "I ran from Boston because I was alone. I am not alone anymore. And I am not getting on a train." Silas shook his head. You don't understand the kind of men you're dealing with. Vance will crush you. I can't offer you a mansion, Josie. I can't offer you protection against the courts. I don't belong in your world. My world. Josie practically spat the words. My world was a prison, Silas. You think I want a mansion? You think I care about the sterling fortune more than my own freedom? She reached out. She grabbed the front of his canvas coat. She held on tight. You listen to me, Josie said, her voice dropping, filled with a fierce, burning heat. Love is not charity. It is not dictated by social class, or how much money a man has in a leather pouch. Love is the choice to stand shoulder to shoulder when the storm hits. Silas stared at her. His chest rose and fell against her hands. You do not get to decide that you are unworthy of me, Josie stated, speaking the truth aloud so there was no mistaking it. That is my choice. Equality in a partnership means we face the wolves together. You taught me how to trust people again, Silas. You gave me a home when I was just a stray in a diner. Do not strip me of my right to choose the man I love just because you're afraid of a lawyer in a pinstripe suit. Silas went perfectly still. The words hung in the air. The man I love. He looked down at her. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes. The fire that Arthur Vance had tried to extinguish for over a decade. It was burning brighter than ever. Silas slowly brought his good hand up. He covered her hands, still gripping his coat. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. He'll come with the sheriff, Silas warned softly. One last attempt to be practical. Josie let go of his coat. She took a step back. A sharp, dangerous smile touched her lips. It was the smile of a predator. Let him come, she said. She turned on her heel. She marched to the table. She shoved the money to the side. She opened her leather journal. She uncapped the brass fountain pen. Locke has a medical warrant based on a fraudulent diagnosis, Josie said, her mind snapping into sharp legal focus. But under federal jurisdiction, a woman claiming abuse of coverture laws can file an immediate injunction against her husband's estate if she proves malicious intent. Silas walked over. He looked at the blank page. How do you prove that? My father's lawyer in Boston, Josie said, the pen hovering over the paper. Mr. Abernathy. He knew Arthur was crooked. He has the original drafts of my father's will, drafts Arthur tried to burn. If we send a telegram to Abernathy, he can file an injunction in Massachusetts. She looked up at Silas. But I have to stay here, she said. I have to file a countersuit in the Kansas territory to invalidate Locke's warrant locally. I need to draft a petition for declaratory judgment. Now, Silas looked at the woman sitting at his kitchen table. She was magnificent. He didn't argue anymore. He walked to the stove. He threw a log on the fire. He grabbed the coffee pot. The magistrate in town is an honest man, Silas said, pouring the dark coffee. Judge Harrison. He doesn't like city boys coming in and throwing their weight around. If you draft that petition, I will ride it into town. I will put it right in his hands before Locke even finishes his breakfast. Josie nodded. She bent her head. The pen touched the paper. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the cabin was the furious scratching of the nib against the parchment. Josie didn't pause. The years of reading her father's law books, the years of silent observation, all poured out onto the page. She cited precedents. She cited territorial statutes. She built a fortress out of words. When she finished, her hand was cramped. She blew on the ink to dry it. She handed the thick stack of papers to Silas. He took them. He read the first page. He couldn't help the slow grin that spread across his face. Vance is going to wish he never heard the name Kansas, Silas murmured. He folded the papers carefully, slipped them into his inside coat pocket. He grabbed his hat. He grabbed his rifle. "Lock the door," Silas said, leaning down. He kissed her forehead. A simple, solid promise. "I'll be back before noon." Josie watched him ride out into the snow. She wasn't afraid. For the first time in her life, she had a weapon of her own making, and a man who was willing to carry it to the front lines for her. The storm broke in Dodge City before it ever reached Ironwood. Silas found Judge Harrison having breakfast at the saloon. Silas didn't ask for permission. He dropped Josie S. thick legal petition right on top of the judge's newspaper. Harrison read it. His eyebrows shot up. The legal argument was airtight. The citations were flawless. When Hiram Locke burst into the magistrate's office an hour later, demanding a local signature to arrest a lunatic, Judge Harrison threw Locke out into the street. He slapped a restraining order on the private investigator, citing harassment under territorial law. Locke took the next train east. He was beat. It was a victory, but it was only the first skirmish. 3 days later, the cabin was quiet again. The snow was melting outside, dripping steadily from the eaves. Silas and Josie sat at the kitchen table. They were preparing the heavy package of documents to mail to Mr. Abernathy in Boston. This was the big strike, the lawsuit that would formally sever Arthur S. control over her and strip him of the sterling fortune. Josie was writing a personal letter to Abernathy. Silas was sorting through the evidence Josie had brought with her, a small bundle of papers she had managed to smuggle out of Arthur's safe before she ran. Financial records, ledger copies, proof of his embezzlement. Silas was a man of details. His Pinkerton training never truly faded. He read every line. He checked every date. He picked up a piece of heavy parchment. It wasn't Arthur's handwriting. It was older, faded ink. "Josie," Silas asked, tracing a line with his finger. "What is this? It looks like a bank draft." Josie looked up from her letter. "That S, one of my father S. old charity ledgers. Arthur kept them. He used them to prove to his friends that my father was soft, wasting money on the poor. I grabbed it by mistake in the dark." Silas nodded. He looked at the paper again. His eyes scanned the lines. Donation. Orphanage in New York. Donation. Sailors Relief Fund in Baltimore. Then his finger stopped. His breath hitched in his throat. December 12th, 1874. Legal Defense Trust. Transferred to Catherine O'Connor. Chicago, Illinois. Silas froze. The cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. The blood rushed in his ears, a loud, roaring sound like a waterfall. He stared at the name. He blinked hard, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. He read it again. Catherine O'Connor. Chicago. It was the widow, the woman whose husband Silas had killed in the Union strike, the family he had destroyed. For years, he had been haunted by the thought of Catherine O'Connor and her 3 children starving in the Chicago winter because he had taken their provider away. In 1874, Catherine O'Connor had miraculously found the funds to sue the Pinkerton Agency for wrongful death. She won a massive settlement. It made the papers. Silas had read about it in a saloon in Missouri. He had always wondered what saint had paid her legal fees, because a poor Irish widow certainly couldn't afford a lawyer to fight the barons. The saint was Nathaniel Sterling. Silas' hands began to shake. The heavy parchment rattled in his grip. Josie set her pen down. She saw the color drain from his face. "Silas? What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Silas slowly lowered the paper. He looked at Josie. He saw her father in the proud slope of her jaw. He saw her father's intelligence in her eyes. Tears welled up in Silas' pale eyes. The tough, hardened cowboy, the man of stone. He sat there, and a tear slipped free, tracking down his scarred cheek. "Silas," Josie panicked slightly. She reached across the table, taking his trembling hand. "Tell me, what is wrong?" Silas couldn't speak for a moment. The lump in his throat was too massive. He swallowed hard. He turned the piece of paper around. He slid it across the table toward her. He tapped a heavy, shaking finger on the entry. "Read that name, Josie," Silas whispered. Josie looked down. "Catherine O'Connor, Chicago, 1874. It's a legal trust my father set up for her. A very large one." She looked up, confused. "Who is she?" "She is the widow," Silas choked out. "The widow of Thomas O'Connor, the man I arrested, the man who died in my holding cell." Josie's breath caught. Her eyes went wide. She looked from the paper to Silas, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Your father," Silas said, his voice breaking, "was the anonymous benefactor. He read about the strike in the papers. He saw the injustice of it. He used his wealth to give that woman a fighting chance against the men I worked for." They sat in stunned silence. The sheer, impossible symmetry of the universe hung heavy in the room. The web of fate that had drawn them together across 1,000 miles. Josie reached out with both hands. She grabbed Silas's large, rough hands and held them tight. Silas looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked up into her eyes. He needed to say this out loud. He needed her to understand the profound lesson that had just struck him, like lightning. "True kindness never truly dies, Josie," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion, but steadying with absolute conviction. "We think the world is just cold dirt and cruel men, but it's not. Your father's humane heart, he saved that family. And in doing so, he saved my soul years ago, long before I even knew it." He squeezed her hands back. "He paid the debt I couldn't pay," Silas continued, speaking the lesson clearly. "And he did it so that today I might have the chance to use my life to protect his daughter. Compassion isn't just a feeling. It's a living thing. It always finds a roundabout way to redeem us all. It circles back." Josie let out a soft sob. She stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped her arms around his neck. She buried her face in his shoulder. Silas held her tight. He buried his face in her hair. The ghost of Thomas O'Connor finally let go of his back. He was forgiven. He was free. An hour later, the sun broke through the clouds. The cabin was warm. Josie sat back down at the table. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her stack. It was the final document. The cover letter to the territorial magistrate to formally change her legal status. She picked up the fountain pen. She wrote the date. She wrote the formal address. Then she got to the signature line. She paused. Arthur Vance had given her a name that felt like a collar. Nathaniel Sterling had given her a name that felt like a heavy crown. She loved her father. She honored him. But she was done living her life for the men of the East Coast. She looked across the room. Silas was standing by the stove, pouring 2 fresh cups of coffee. He looked at peace. Josie looked down at the paper. She didn't hesitate. She wrote with bold, sweeping strokes. "Josephine Sterling Montgomery." She blew on the ink. She looked at the name. It looked right. It looked like freedom. Silas walked over. He set a cup of coffee down next to her. He glanced down at the paper. He saw the signature. He stopped. He stared at the name. Montgomery. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't ask if she thought it was too fast. He just set his own coffee cup down. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. A grounding, solid weight. "We'll need to go into town tomorrow," Silas said quietly. "Judge Harrison can perform a civil ceremony right in his office. Doesn't take long." Josie smiled. She placed her hand over his. $2, Josie said softly. "Seems like a very fair price for a brand new life." "It's a bargain," Silas agreed. He looked out the window. The snow was melting fast. The hard ground of the prairie was softening, getting ready for the spring. Getting ready for the seeds they were about to plant together. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. It was a flimsy piece of yellow paper, brought out by a rider from Dodge City. Silas paid the boy a dime, took the paper, and walked it into the cabin. Josie was wiping down the table. She saw the look on his face. She stopped. Silas unfolded the paper. He didn't read it to himself first. He read it straight out loud. From the desk of Thomas Abernathy, Esquire, Silas read, his voice steady. Injunction successful. Arthur Vance stripped of all guardianship claims. Indicted for fraud. Your inheritance is secure, Mrs. Vance. Awaiting your return to Boston. Silas lowered the paper. It was over. The ghost was dead. The gilded cage was broken. Josie stood perfectly still. The silence in the cabin stretched. It wasn't a heavy silence. It was the sudden, ringing quiet that comes right after a long war ends. Silas looked at the telegram. Then he looked at her. You're a very rich woman, Josie, Silas said softly. You can buy a train ticket tomorrow. First class. Go back east. Take your father's empire. Josie took the yellow paper from his hand. She looked at Abernathy's neat typed letters. Then she walked over to the cast iron stove. She opened the heavy door. The fire was burning bright. She tossed the telegram right on to the hot coals. The paper curled. It blackened. It flared into a quick, bright flame, and then it was just ash. She turned back to Silas. I am not Mrs. Vance, Josie said. Her voice was calm, certain. And I don't want an empire in Boston. I want a ranch in Kansas, Silas smiled. A slow, deep smile that reached all the way to his pale eyes. They rode into town the very next morning. They didn't wear fancy clothes. Josie wore a clean blue cotton dress she had sewn herself. Silas wore his best denim trousers and a clean white shirt. They went straight to Judge Harrison's office. Mateo and his wife, Maria, stood behind them. The judge cleared his throat. He read the standard vows. Do you, Josephine, take this man? I do, Josie said, clear as a bell. When it came time to sign the registry, the judge pushed the heavy ledger forward. He handed Josie the pen. She dipped the nib in the ink. She didn't hesitate. Josephine Sterling Montgomery. Silas looked down at the signature. He put his hand over hers. A name ain't a brand, Silas said quietly, looking her in the eye. A brand means somebody owns you. But a name you choose for yourself. That means you own your own life. Welcome home, Mrs. Montgomery. 3 years passed. The Kansas prairie didn't change much. The winters were still brutal. The summers still baked the earth dry. But Ironwood Ranch changed. It grew. The roof didn't sag anymore. Silas and Mateo had framed a new one out of thick cedar. The herd had doubled. There were 2 new farmhands sleeping in the bunkhouse. But the biggest change wasn't out in the pastures. It was right inside the main cabin. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1882. The sun was golden, slanting through the new, larger windows Silas had cut into the log walls. The front room wasn't just a parlor anymore. It was a classroom. 5 women sat around the heavy oak table. Maria was there. So were the wives of 3 local farmers and a young girl who worked at the diner in town. Josie stood at the head of the table. She wasn't holding a cooking spoon. She was holding a piece of white chalk. Behind her, a large slate board hung on the wall. It was covered in legal terms: leasehold, interest, title. Josie pointed to the board. Now, Josie said, her voice carrying that same crisp, educated tone, but warmed by years of prairie sun. When the bank hands you a paper with these words, what do you do? Maria raised her hand timidly. We do not sign right away. Exactly, Josie smiled. You do not sign. You read. And if you cannot read it, you bring it here. Josie set the chalk down. She rested her hands on the table, leaning forward to look at every single woman in the room. This was the part of the lesson that mattered most. Not the vocabulary, the truth behind it. "I want you all to listen to me very carefully," Josie said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "For too long, the world has told women that the law is a man's business. They tell us that numbers and contracts are too heavy for our minds. They tell us to just sign where they point." She shook her head. "That is a lie," Josie declared. "Education is the one thing no man, no husband, and no law can ever take from you. With a pen, we master our contracts. With our voices, we master our destinies." She looked at Maria, whose husband had almost lost their farm 3 years ago to a bad lease. "We are not property to be owned," Josie said, stating the educational value aloud, making sure it echoed in the corners of the room. "We are human beings. When a woman knows the law works for her. Equality does not come from waiting for men to be kind. Equality comes from knowing your rights and having the courage to speak them out loud. Your voice is your absolute right. Never let anyone tell you to swallow it." The women nodded. Some had tears in their eyes. For most of them, this was the first time in their lives anyone had told them they were smart enough to hold their own fate in their hands. "Class dismissed." Josie smiled softly. "Read chapter 4 by next week. And Maria, take that extra loaf of bread home to Mateo." The women filed out, chattering happily, clutching their notebooks like shields. Josie turned to wipe the slate clean. She heard a boot scrape against the floorboards. She turned around. Silas was leaning against the doorframe. He had his dusty hat in his hands. He was watching her. He had been standing there for the last 10 minutes. He didn't look like a haunted man anymore. The heavy, dark shadow that used to sit on his shoulders was gone. He looked older, sure, a little more gray at the temples. But his eyes were clear. He walked into the room. He stepped up behind her. He reached around and gently took the chalk eraser from her hand. He set it on the ledge. Then he took her hands in his. Her hands weren't soft and pale anymore. They were strong, calloused, stained slightly with black ink and white chalk. Silas ran his thumb over her knuckles. "You sounded like a judge up there," Silas murmured, a low, proud rumble in his chest. Josie leaned back against him. "I just told them the truth, Silas. The world is a hard place. They need armor." Silas turned her around. He looked down into her eyes. "3 years ago," Silas said quietly, "you walked into a diner in Dodge. You wouldn't speak. You wouldn't look a man in the eye. You were terrified of your own shadow." He looked around the room, at the law books on the shelves, at the slates, at the empty chairs that had just held women learning how to defend themselves. "I thought I was just hiring a maid," Silas said, shaking his head slowly in wonder. "I thought I was just giving a stray a place to hide out the winter." He reached up, tucking a stray lock of brown hair behind her ear. "You didn't just save yourself, Josie," Silas said, speaking the final truth of their journey together. "You took the very thing that broke you, and you turned it into a weapon to protect everyone else. You saved me, and I reckon you're going to save this whole damn territory before you're done." Josie smiled. She reached up and rested her hand against his rough, scarred cheek. "We saved each other," she whispered. Silas leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a rushed, desperate thing. It was slow, deep. The kiss of a man who finally believed he deserved the good thing he was holding. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. "Come on outside," Silas said. "Sun's going down. Sky looks like it's on fire." They walked out the front door together. The wind was sweeping across the tall prairie grass. It was a good wind, fresh and cool. The sky was a massive canvas of orange, purple, and bruised gold. They stood side by side on the porch of Ironwood Ranch. Josie looked out at the vast open space. Once, it had terrified her. The emptiness of it. Now she understood it. It wasn't empty at all. It was just a blank page. A place with no walls. A place waiting for someone brave enough to write a new story. She leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. They didn't need to say anything else. The silence between them wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was just peace. The quiet, steady peace of a man and a woman who had fought the world, won back their souls, and finally found their way home. This story reminds us that sometimes the people who save us are not heroes with wealth or power, but ordinary souls with compassionate hearts. Love, respect, forgiveness, and human dignity are the true treasures of life. On this channel, we share emotional Western stories about cowboys, frontier romance, motherhood, sacrifice, family bonds, and the beauty of human compassion. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
As the prairie winds finally grew quiet over Ironwood Ranch, Josephine Sterling understood something that many people spend their entire lives searching for. Freedom was never hidden inside the grand mansions of Boston, nor inside wealth, status, or family names written in gold. True freedom was found in the simple right to speak without fear, to be treated with dignity, and to stand beside someone who loved her, not as property, but as an equal human soul. And perhaps that is the deepest heartbeat of this story. In a harsh world shaped by greed, power, and cruelty, two wounded people discovered that compassion still has the power to save a life. Silas Montgomery carried years of guilt like chains around his heart. He believed one terrible mistake had forever condemned him to loneliness and suffering. But through Josephine, he learned that redemption does not come from hiding from the past. It comes from choosing kindness every single day afterward. And Josephine, a woman silenced by fear and trapped by unjust laws, discovered that her voice was never truly gone. It had only been buried beneath years of pain. Together, they healed one another in a way neither of them expected. Not through grand speeches or riches, but through trust, patience, honesty, and quiet acts of humanity. This story reminds us that some of the strongest people are the ones who have been broken the deepest. It teaches us that dignity belongs to every human being, regardless of wealth, gender, or social class. It teaches us that love is not control, ownership, or power. Real love is standing shoulder to shoulder when the storms arrive. It is choosing loyalty when fear would be easier. It is protecting someone's soul when the world tries to crush it. And maybe the greatest lesson hidden beneath this Western tale is this: kindness always leaves a mark. A single act of mercy can travel across years, across generations, and across broken lives in ways we may never fully understand. Nathaniel Sterling's compassion toward a grieving widow eventually found its way back to save his own daughter. Silas's decision to help a frightened stranger in a diner changed both of their destinies forever. The world may often seem cold and unforgiving, but stories like this remind us that goodness still survives in ordinary people willing to choose empathy over cruelty. Here on this channel, we continue bringing you heartfelt Western stories filled with cowboy courage, frontier romance, family bonds, sacrifice, motherhood, compassion, redemption, and the enduring spirit of humanity beneath the endless skies of the Old West. If this story touched your heart tonight, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your support truly helps keep these stories alive for others who still believe in love, hope, and second chances. And if you'd like to ride with us again into more emotional journeys across the American frontier, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, may your heart stay brave, your soul stay kind, and may the prairie winds always guide you home.